The physical agony after my Amish nuptials left me practically unable to remain upright, prompting the physician to inquire who had convinced me that such suffering was a routine part of life. At 19 years old, I found myself sitting in a county medical facility 3 days following my wedding, still clad in the dark hosiery my mother had provided for my transition to a new household. Outside, rain beat against the slender glass pane, while the examination room filled with the stark scents of chemical antiseptics and damp, heavy wool. Merely keeping my balance required me to grip the edge of the examination table with all my strength. Setting a blue envelope down on the surface next to me, the doctor softly questioned who had led me to believe this state of body was normal. Just beyond the doorway stood my newly wedded husband alongside our community bishop. My mother had flatly declined to accompany me into the room, and that specific envelope had been deliberately kept from my sight for nearly 24 months. I recognized instantly that whatever response escaped my lips would result in someone losing their place in the community, though I failed to grasp back then that the sanctuary they were all striving to protect was never intended for my shelter. To reconstruct the sequence of events that brought me to that hospital room, I have to look back to the summer I reached my 17th year, back when I still held the conviction that absorbing physical distress was a quiet, mandatory obligation of being a dutiful daughter. My upbringing took place within the Alder Creek district, located in a rural pocket of Ohio. It is not my place to declare how every Amish household or spiritual leader conducts themselves. I can only recount the specific lessons imparted within our own kitchen and the consequences that unfolded when a terrified household chose to mistake absolute silence for religious devotion. My father passed away when I was 14, leaving my mother to manage 6 offspring, a modest farming property, and financial obligations that far exceeded her means. Because my elder sister Miriam had already entered into marriage, the daily burdens fell to me, working right alongside my mother at the kitchen stove, over the wash tubs, and out across the open fields. Demonstrating practical utility was the solitary thing capable of softening her stern expression. The very first time my body buckled from the internal strain, I was carrying preservation crocks down into the cellar. I still vividly recall the icy sensation of the stone step pressing into my knees and the sharp aroma of vinegar rising from a shattered vessel. Finding me with my hands clamped tightly over my midsection, my mother simply told me that I was transitioning into womanhood. When I expressed that such a sensation was entirely unfamiliar and terrifying, she dismissed it by stating that young girls are never properly prepared for the transition, but reassured me that it would fade. It did subside after a couple of hours, only to return with the same intensity 4 weeks later, and then the month after that. On certain days, I forced myself to work right through the agony. On others, the lightheadedness grew so severe that my entire field of vision seemed to constrict around me. My mother would brew remedies of raspberry leaf tea, place a heated brick by my feet to soothe the chill, and strictly command me never to speak of these episodes to anyone outside our immediate walls. Our relative Aunt Vera, who frequently stepped in to assist local women during childbed and bouts of sickness, paid us a visit after I lost consciousness near the washhouse one afternoon. Placing her hand against my brow, she pointedly asked my mother how long these physical spells had been occurring. Before a word could form in my throat, my mother answered for me, claiming that I simply possessed a fragile disposition when exhaustion set in. Aunt Vera kept her gaze fixed on me for a long beat, noting that any distress capable of draining the absolute color from a young girl's countenance demanded a proper evaluation. My mother's expression hardened instantly as she demanded to know who exactly would perform such an exam. Vera offered no reply. Within the boundaries of our district, the closest practicing physician operated 12 miles away, and arranging a visit to his office required financial resources, invited intrusive inquiries, and created a permanent paper trail. Those 3 specific consequences terrified my mother far more than a physical affliction she could not visually perceive. That subsequent autumn, my body completely gave out while I was inside Clara Hess's dry goods establishment. Clara, who was not a member of our faith community, immediately placed me into her vehicle and transported me directly to the county clinic. For the very first time in my life, a person asked me to actively describe the sensations in my body rather than dictating to me what those sensations meant. The attending physician, Dr. Harland, was a lean gentleman framed by silver spectacles. Though his manner of speaking was entirely gentle, his demeanor turned profoundly serious following my physical assessment. He explained that a definitive diagnosis required deeper testing, yet he harbored deep concerns regarding a potential cyst or an alternative internal issue that necessitated the care of a medical specialist. My mother managed to arrive before the physician had even finished his explanation, taking up a position right by the doorway with the ties of her bonnet visibly trembling against her outerwear. At the time, I assumed her trembling was rooted in sheer terror for my well-being, failing to recognize that she was equally paralyzed by the impending medical costs, the state of the farm, the authority of the bishop, and the terrifying prospect that a formal medical diagnosis might outrun the community's capacity to control the narrative. Dr. Harland neatly placed several medical documents inside a blue envelope and extended it directly to her, advising that I needed to be seen by a specialist before the month reached its end. My mother questioned whether my life was in immediate jeopardy, to which he responded that he could provide no such guarantee. That singular phrase anchored itself deeply in my mind, even though my mother later insisted that my memory of his words was entirely flawed. Throughout the entire journey back to our farm, she kept the blue envelope tucked completely out of sight beneath her apron, promising me that we would make the trip back to the clinic once the autumn harvest concluded. When winter arrived, it brought a fresh set of complications to delay us, followed by spring and its own demands. I desperately wanted to place my faith in her words, because a daughter who harbors doubts about her own mother requires an alternative foundation for her trust, and I possessed nowhere else to turn. Consequently, the blue envelope vanished from sight altogether. A year down the road, Bishop Eli Yoder commenced a series of regular visits to our household. Whenever I crossed the threshold into the room, all conversation would cease instantly, leaving me to catch only disconnected fragments of their talk, noting mentions of the property mortgage, the South Field, the neighboring Miller family, and a specific pledge my father had made before his passing. Shortly thereafter, Amos Miller began paying court to me. He was 24 years old, reserved in demeanor, and belonged to the dairy operation that bordered our own acreage. During our very first unmonitored conversation, he inquired whether my preference leaned toward pear orchards or apple orchards, and when I opted for pears, he went out and planted a young pear tree near the residence where he intended to establish a household with a wife. My mother perceived a deep sense of security and kindness in the planting of that tree, while I viewed it as a desperate route of escape from the suffocating terror that our family farm would be seized and sold. Bishop Yoder, however, envisioned a completely different outcome. Two adjacent agricultural properties consolidated into one, a lingering debt fully wiped clean, and yet another traditional family unit securely anchored within the geographic boundaries of the district. No one ever explicitly commanded me that I was required to enter into wedlock with Amos. They merely painted a vivid picture of the ruin that would unfold if I refused him. My mother stood to lose her entire acreage, my younger brothers would be forced into hired labor for strangers, and my late father's memory would remain permanently tarnished by unfulfilled financial vows. By the time Amos formally extended his proposal, turning him down felt equivalent to setting a torch to my mother's own kitchen, so I gave him my consent. The initial indicator of trouble emerged during our period of betrothal, when I experienced another severe physical attack while assisting my mother with the stitching of quilts. I remained bent double over the wooden frame until the worst of the internal pressure finally subsided, unaware that Amos had arrived at the entrance and witnessed my state. He inquired directly if a sickness had taken hold of me, but my mother immediately intervened, stating that women simply endure their natural seasons. His gaze remained locked onto me as he questioned whether the condition would disrupt the management of the household. A deep sense of shame washed over me, despite the reality that I had committed no fault whatsoever. My mother firmly reassured him that I had never once permitted my physical condition to interfere with my domestic obligations, which prompted a nod of understanding from Amos. He then addressed me in a mild tone, stating that once a marriage is finalized, all intimate matters concerning the body ought to remain strictly confined between a husband and his wife, noting that outsiders only breed unnecessary trouble out of things they cannot comprehend. Within his words, I heard a promise of protective privacy, failing to recognize the underlying framework of total control. 6 weeks prior to our wedding date, Miriam caught my arm and pulled me into the privacy of the food pantry, while our mother and Amos were occupied out in the barn structures. She urgently whispered to ask if our mother had ever permitted the county physician to evaluate me again, causing me to stare at her in silence. Lowering her voice even further, Miriam revealed that on the specific day I collapsed at the dry goods shop, a blue envelope had been issued. When I questioned how she came across this information, she disclosed that our mother had explicitly ordered her to destroy the packet by fire the previous winter. When I asked if she had complied, she confessed that she had hidden it inside our mother's sewing chest. Instead, before another question could form, the door latch clicked upward, and our mother stood on the threshold holding a gathering basket filled with eggs, causing Miriam to instantly create distance between us. Without altering the pitch of her voice, our mother simply informed Miriam that her husband was waiting for her back at their property. A look passed over Miriam's features that was not exactly indicative of fear, but rather a profound sense of recognition, and she departed the house before the evening meal could be served. Later that evening, I quietly pried open the lid of my mother's sewing chest, only to discover that the blue envelope was completely missing. My mother continued to guide a threaded needle through her fabric without once lifting her eyes to meet mine, remarks that my sister simply possessed a fondness for elevating mere worries into grand dramas. I questioned whether the physician had expressed genuine alarm for my health, to which she answered that he merely observed a destitute family and recognized a prime opportunity to extract money from us. When I pushed further, asking why Miriam claimed she wanted the documents reduced to ashes, my mother drew her thread entirely through the cloth and stated that written paper tends to outlive human explanations. At that juncture, I assumed she meant the medical provider had merely prone to exaggeration. Only now do I recognize that she was issuing a profound warning to me without ever intending to do so. 3 weeks before the scheduled nuptials, the internal agony surged back with terrifying sharpness. Standing outside the meeting house, I took the opportunity to ask Aunt Vera if it was normal for a girl to be utterly incapable of straightening her spine. Her eyes shifted immediately toward my mother, who was currently locked in conversation with Bishop Yoder, before she quietly uttered a plain denial. I pleaded for her assistance, causing her fingers to tighten around my hand for a brief, fleeting instant. She stated that once the wedding concluded, it would be my husband's sole prerogative to determine what medical interventions were required. When I reminded her that she had previously insisted I needed an examination, she replied that she had spoken out of turn before she truly comprehended the exact financial and social position of my family. When I demanded to know what position she meant, she fell completely silent and refused to utter another word. That encounter marked my final failed attempt to secure intervention, and it simultaneously taught me the bitter lesson that a person can clearly perceive a looming catastrophe and still consciously choose the safety of total submission to authority. Our wedding ceremony took place on a bitter, frosty Thursday in the month of November. The household buzzed with activity long before the sun ever cleared the horizon, characterized by the scraping of wooden benches across the floorboards, the boiling of coffee, and the realization that my dark blue wedding attire draped loosely over my frame because the chronic pain had caused me to waste away. As her fingers worked to secure the metal fastenings down my spine, I made one final attempt to ask whether Dr. Harland had formally declared me unwell. Her movements ceased entirely for a moment before she resumed securing the dress, dismissing my inquiry by stating that I was merely experiencing natural bridal nervousness, all while refusing to catch my reflection in the looking glass. Throughout the formal service, Bishop Yoder delivered a sermon centered heavily on structural duty and the consolidation of two households. Midways through his delivery, that intimately familiar internal pressure began to claw at my insides again. By the time the wedding feast was laid out, I found myself virtually unable to swallow a single morsel of food, yet I forced my body to keep serving the assembly until a dish slipped from my grasp, sending warm gravy splashing across my skin. Miriam managed to intercept the falling vessel before it impacted the floor, whispering urgently that I looked as pale as flour. Our mother materialized between us instantly, attributing my appearance to a lack of food, which caused Miriam to stare back at her and fiercely counter that hunger was not the cause. For one passing second, I genuinely believed my sister was going to expose the entire hidden truth right there in front of everyone. Instead, my mother gripped her firmly by the elbow and guided her directly into the pantry space. I never managed to learn what words passed between them, and Miriam departed the gathering long before the last of the wedding guests said their goodbyes. That night, confined to the modest dwelling situated right beside the Miller property, my entire body shook violently from a combination of raw terror and physical torment. I will choose to leave the private details of what transpired within the confines of that marital bedchamber unspoken. By the midnight hour, I was physically incapable of unbending my back, and the moment I attempted to put weight on my feet, my legs folded completely beneath me. Amos managed to lift me onto the bedding, his face registering a clear sense of panic, even as he kept his tone completely measured, murmuring that his own mother had mentioned brides occasionally suffer physical distress in the beginning. I begged him to go find a doctor for me that very night, but he simply touched the fringe of the bedding rather than offering his hand, noting that people in the community would inevitably start asking questions about what was wrong. When I cried out that I no longer cared about their talk, he flatly replied that he did care. Entering into marriage had effectively stripped away my personal right to determine which degree of physical agony merited outside inquiry. By the arrival of morning, a raging fever had taken hold of my body. My mother came to the house bearing a jar of broth, and I mistakenly assumed her presence meant Amos had possessed the honesty to tell her the true extent of my condition. She took a seat next to my bed and noted that the initial days of a marriage can prove quite trying, to which I countered that this was something far beyond mere marital adjustment. Her gaze drifted toward the window pane as she remarked that the ailment would eventually pass, prompting me to ask who had assured her of that. Folding a cloth over the top of the broth jar, she replied that it was simply knowledge women possessed. When I directly asked if the county doctor had expressly warned her that this specific crisis would occur, she stood up with such sudden force that the legs of her wooden chair screeched loudly against the floorboards. Amos entered the room before she could formulate a response, and I watched a silent look pass between the two of them, an exchange that felt deeply practiced and understood, rather than spontaneous. That single shared glance filled me with a terror that far eclipsed my physical agony. Once she departed, I demanded to know exactly what information Amos was harboring, and he confessed that he had only been informed I suffered from general feminine ailments. When I asked if my mother had ever permitted him to read the physician's written documents, he uttered a negative response just a fraction of a second too quickly. The following afternoon, while Amos was occupied out in the barn, I began searching the living space for enough hidden currency to hire an outside driver to take me away. Tucked away inside his writing desk, buried beneath an accumulation of financial receipts and property maps, I discovered the blue envelope. My own name was inscribed across the front in the distinct handwriting of Dr. Harland, and the paper adhesive had clearly been broken. Tucked inside was the official specialist referral, an outstanding medical invoice, and a handwritten communication addressed from my mother to Amos. Within the text, she explicitly informed him that while the medical professional suspected a highly dangerous internal condition, nothing had been definitively proven, and she insisted that my physical symptoms had to remain completely confidential until after the marriage vows were officially exchanged. She pointedly reminded him that Bishop Yoder had already granted his official blessing to the property consolidation, and that the Miller family was poised to absorb our household's debts. At the very bottom of the page, she had penned a solitary concluding thought, that I would always choose path of obedience once I truly understood the magnitude of what others stood to lose. Up until that exact moment, I had harbored the belief that my compliance with the wedding was an act of salvation for my family. That hidden note revealed the devastating truth that my family had merely weaponized that belief to ensure the wedding took place. A sudden shadow fell across the surface of the desk, and I looked up to see Amos standing directly in the entryway. He made no attempt to ask what specific papers I held in my hands. He merely stated that my mother genuinely believed the medical provider was uncertain about the diagnosis. When I confronted him with the fact that he had explicitly lied to me about ever seeing the documents, he defended himself by saying he simply did not want me overcome with terror before we stood at the altar. I countered that he knew all along I might be profoundly sick, to which he conceded that he knew there was a history of pain, admitting he knew just enough to keep the documentation hidden out of sight. He sank into a seat and buried his face in his hands, finally disclosing the reality that my father had taken out significant loans from the Miller family following 2 consecutive seasons of failed crops. Bishop Yoder had put forward the marriage arrangement as a discreet mechanism to merge the agricultural holdings and erase the financial obligation without exposing the family to public disgrace within the church. Amos claimed he never desired a spouse who felt coerced by financial ruin, prompting me to ask why he had ever agreed to the arrangement in the first place. He replied that he truly believed I desired the exact same outcome, to which I answered that my only desire was to ensure my mother kept a roof over her head. He cast his eyes down toward the envelope and questioned if my motivation was truly any different from his own. It was profoundly different, but at 19 years of age, trapped in a broken body and newly shackled to a husband, I did not yet possess the words to articulate why. Amos eventually offered a compromise, promising that he would personally transport me to see Dr. Harland on Monday if my condition failed to show improvement. He stated we would simply inform the bishop that a sudden fever had gripped me following the wedding festivities. He then reduced my mother's handwritten note to ashes inside the heating stove, though he allowed me to retain physical possession of the specialist referral. That singular promise provided just enough psychological hope to keep me breathing until Monday arrived. On Sunday evening, however, Bishop Yoder made an unannounced appearance at our home. He declined to step foot into my recovery room, choosing instead to conduct his conversation with Amos directly in the kitchen space, but the structural walls of the dwelling were thin enough that every word carried through. The bishop firmly stated that making a trip to an outside medical facility at this juncture would inevitably invite public gossip, and when Amos countered that I was physically unable to stand, the leader simply mandated that I should consequently remain confined to my bed, noting that the physician had already issued warnings to them previously. A profound, suffocating silence filled the house before Bishop Yoder declared that the doctor's written document carried absolutely no spiritual or practical authority within our community. I waited in the dark, desperately listening for Amos to raise his voice in my defense, but instead he merely questioned what would become of the consolidated land agreement if I were to leave. The entire room seemed to spin on its axis. The bishop firmly responded that a wife's proper place was strictly under the supervision and custody of her husband, commanding him to keep me contained within the home until the domestic routine was fully established. Prior to that moment, I had comforted myself with the thought that Amos was a fellow victim trapped right alongside me. Now, the chilling realization washed over me that he was merely acting as a prison guard over the property assets he had successfully acquired. He stepped back into the bedroom and informed me that making the trip on Monday was simply too premature. I thrust the referral document out toward him, reminding him of his solemn oath, but he simply looked from the paper to the doorframe, stating that we would revisit the matter once the fever subsided. When I pressed him on what would happen if the fever never broke, his voice remained entirely tranquil as he stated he refused to bring public disgrace upon both of our families, merely because I was operating out of fear. That chilling tranquility left a far deeper scar on my psyche than an outburst of raw rage ever could have. Just as the dawn was beginning to break, a soft tapping sounded against my bedroom window pane. It was Miriam, who had traveled the entire distance from the main road on foot out of terror that the distinct sound of a horse-drawn buggy would alert the household to her presence. Her footwear was caked in heavy mud, and she had brought along an extra coat intended for me, whispering that Clara was waiting in her vehicle down by the bridge to drive me away. As Miriam worked to help me lift my torso, I realized I lacked the physical capability to slip my feet into my shoes, but she reassured me that we would simply carry them with us. Suddenly, our mother stepped directly into the doorway, her eyes darting from the winter coat to the unlatched window as the reality of the situation clicked in her mind. She commanded us to cease our actions, but Miriam immediately positioned her body as a physical barrier between us, declaring that I required urgent medical intervention. My mother's facial features instantly turned to stone as she warned that if I chose to abscond in secrecy, the Miller family would have every legal right to claim they were victims of marital deception, which would empower them to seize the family farm entirely. Miriam fiercely countered that they should go ahead and take it, but our mother pointedly reminded her that our younger brothers still resided on that land, before turning her gaze directly onto me to remind me that my own father's remains were interred in that soil. I looked at her and asked directly if she had possessed full knowledge all along that I was suffering from a life-threatening illness. She hesitated before answering, and that brief, silent pause constituted the most profound betrayal of my entire life because it held the weight of an absolute admission. At the beginning, she claimed, she genuinely believed my symptoms were merely indicative of a delicate constitution, and later on, she assumed the entire matter could be properly managed once I was securely settled into my new life. I clarified her words, asking if she meant managed once I no longer possessed the legal or social agency to decline the marriage, to which she replied she meant once everyone's safety was fully secured. Miriam sharply interjected that everyone would be safe except for me, causing our mother to flinch as though she had been struck across the face. She then raised her voice to summon Amos. The window was slammed shut, My coat was stripped away, and Miriam was forced off the property under a stern warning from Bishop Yoder that any further meddling on her part would result in her being formally brought before the Congregation for Church Discipline. By the time the sun fully illuminated the sky, even Amos could no longer maintain the illusion of normalcy. My body completely collapsed on the floorboards right beside the washstand, and the moment Aunt Vera laid eyes on my condition, her lifelong commitment to rigid community obedience dissolved entirely. She firmly declared that I was leaving for the hospital immediately, warning them that if they delayed any further, they would find themselves organizing a funeral instead. Those were the precise words that finally compelled them to take action, not my own agonizing pleas, not the explicit written warnings of the medical professional, and not my sister's desperate rescue plot. The solitary thing that moved them was the terrifying prospect of a corpse and a burial that they would be utterly unable to explain away to the secular authorities. Amos drove me directly to the county medical facility, accompanied by Bishop Yoder, who refused to allow Amos to interact with the outside world unmonitored. My mother followed behind them in a separate buggy, yet she chose to remain stationed out in the hallway. That was the exact sequence of events that returned me to the examination room where this account first opened. Just before the attending nurse closed the door to the room, my mother managed to catch hold of my wrist with fingers that felt entirely ice-cold, whispering an urgent command that I must tell the doctors the sickness had only commenced after the wedding vows, insisting on a narrative of 3 days of sudden illness rather than 2 full years of chronic decline. Bishop Yoder stood right at her shoulder, remarking that absolutely no spiritual benefit comes from handing worldly outsiders a narrative they are culturally incapable of understanding. For one,